Every time a new president takes the oath of office, they come in with this big idea, right? A vision for America's place in the world. And that vision, well, it affects everything from the economy to our security. But what happens when that grand plan smacks right into the real world? That's what we're talking about today. We're going to break down the master plan for American foreign policy, the grand strategy.
All right, so here's the big puzzle that we're going to tackle. We always hear that the President of the United States is the most powerful person in the world, right? I mean, it's a common saying. But if that's really true, why does American foreign policy often feel so reactive, kind of all over the place, like it's just lurching from one crisis to the next? Why is it so incredibly hard to actually stick to a plan?
Well, this quote right here from the constitutional scholar Edwin Corwin, it kind of nails it. He called the Constitution an invitation to struggle. Think about that. It's not a clear-cut rulebook saying, the president does this. No. It's more like the starting whistle for a tug of war, a constant battle for control over foreign policy between the White House, Congress, and a whole lot of other players. So presidential power? It's never a given. It's always a negotiation.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll get into the grand strategy puzzle itself. Then, we'll look at a president's foreign policy toolkit. After that, we've got 3 case studies: a failed attempts, a flawed success, and the modern challenge. And finally, we'll wrap it all up with the grand strategy verdict.
All right, let's jump into it. We're going to start with a president's foreign policy toolkit. This is basically the framework we need to understand why some presidents can pull off their big vision and why so many others, well, just can't.
So, what is a grand strategy? Anyway, it's not just some checklist. The best way to think about it is like an architect's master blueprint for a country's entire role in the world. It's that one big idea that's supposed to connect all the dots, linking the nation's goals with all of its resources. Its diplomatic muscle, its economic power, and its military might. It's the whole shebang, the guiding principle for everything. Okay, so any grand strategy has to survive 3 different levels of influence, and they're all connected. First up, you've got the individual level. That's the president, their personality, their core beliefs. But that personal vision almost immediately slams into the second level, the domestic. And this is like a buzzsaw. We're talking Congress, public opinion, the economy. And then, hovering over all of it, is the third level, the systemic. This is the wild card, all the stuff happening out in the world, global crises, things you just can't predict. To succeed, a president has to master all 3.
That domestic level is so important that we can break it down into what's basically a 5-point test for success. Think of it as a gauntlet a president has to run through. To get anything done, they need what experts call a permissive environment. And that means a unified team of advisors, their party in control of Congress, a strong presidency with lots of political capital, the public on their side, and a strong economy. I mean, just look at that list. Getting all 5 of those to line up, that is really, really tough.
Okay, theory is one thing, but let's see how this framework holds up in the real world. Our first case study is what you could call a failed attempt. President Jimmy Carter. Now, Carter came into office with a really clear vision for foreign policy, but as we'll see, that just wasn't enough. So let's put Carter through that 5-point test. Okay, he gets 1 check mark. His party, the Democrats, controlled Congress. That's a good start, but that's about it. His advisory team famously split right down the middle. His presidency was seen as politically weak, public support was dropping, and the economy? It was a mess, with something called stagflation and a huge energy crisis. He was missing 4 out of the 5 ingredients. That permissive environment he needed, it just wasn't there.
And as if all those problems at home weren't enough, the outside world threw him some massive curveballs. The systemic level just came at him full force. You had the Iran hostage crisis, and then the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. These 2 events were like a 1-2 punch that totally scrambled the global chessboard. Carter was forced to react, and his original grand strategy got completely pushed to the side. In the end, these crises are what people remembered.
All right, now let's flip the script and look at a completely different situation. Our second case study is President George W. Bush, and this one is fascinating. It's what our source material calls a flawed success. That's where a president actually succeeds in launching a massive grand strategy, but history ends up questioning whether it was a good idea in the first place.
Just look at the domestic environment for President Bush, especially right after 9/11. I mean, it's the complete opposite of Carter. A unified team? Check. Bipartisan support from Congress? Absolutely, check. A super strong presidency? Check. Off-the-charts public support? A huge check. He basically got a perfect score on our 5-point test. It was the absolute perfect storm.
the ideal permissive environment for rolling out a massive, game-changing grand strategy.
But this raises a really, really important question. Just because you can successfully launch a strategy, does that automatically make it a good strategy? The analysis here suggests that no, not at all. Successfully putting a plan into motion is one thing. Whether that plan is actually wise or beneficial in the long run, well, that's a whole different story.
And for President Bush, the systemic shock that changed everything was, of course, 9/11. Now, think back to Carter. He was dealing with multiple separate crises. For Bush, it was one single catastrophic event that unified the country in a way we hadn't seen in decades. It created that domestic unity we were just talking about, and it became the catalyst for a very clear, very aggressive new grand strategy, the global war on terror.
Okay, on to our final case study, which really represents the modern challenge. President Barack Obama. The world he inherited was just messy. It was full of complex, tangled-up crises that made forging one single, overarching grand strategy incredibly difficult.
So if we run Obama through the domestic gauntlet, what do we see? It's a real mixed bag. He had a pretty unified team, and he came in with a strong mandate from the voters. But he was immediately hit with the worst recession in generations, the public was super divided, and he faced a Congress that was incredibly partisan and often gridlocked. That permissive environment that a president needs, for him, it just never fully materialized.
And then you look at the systemic level, the world stage. It wasn't one big shock like it was for Bush. It wasn't even two major crises like Carter. For Obama, it was like a constant cascade of problems. He inherited the global financial crisis. Then came the Arab Spring, which reshaped the entire Middle East. And then he had to deal with the rise of a totally new kind of threat with ISIS. It was like a game of global whack-a-mole, and there was no single, simple strategy that could handle it all.
So, okay, we've looked at three very different presidents, three very different moments in time. What's the takeaway here? Let's get to the verdict on grand strategy. When you put Carter and Bush side by side, the lesson is crystal clear. Carter's story shows us that a great vision means almost nothing if you don't have the support at home to make it happen. But the lesson from Bush is just as important. Having that domestic unity, having everyone on board, lets you enact a powerful strategy, for sure. But it says absolutely nothing about whether that strategy is actually a good one.
And that brings us to the main event, the crucial point of this whole analysis. For a grand strategy to actually work, you need this incredibly rare alignment of everything we've been talking about. You need the right leader with the right vision, connecting with a supportive domestic environment, all at the perfect global moment. It's like trying to catch lightning in a bottle. All the stars have to align, and that almost never happens. Which really leaves us with one big, lingering question for today. When you look at the world right now, with all the nonstop crises abroad and the deep, deep political divisions we have right here at home, you have to wonder, is the whole idea of a single, coherent grand strategy even possible anymore? Or is it a relic of a different time? Something to chew on. Thanks for digging into this with us.